When 19-year-old Amal stepped onto the weathered wooden boat at dawn, the sea shimmered like a sheet of silver. Her hands trembled as she held a torn map and a small backpack filled with medicine and packets of food. She had never been to Gaza, never even met the children she hoped to help, but she couldn't ignore the stories of their suffering. With one deep breath, she pushed her little boat into the waves, knowing the journey ahead could cost her everything. As her boat drifted away, people on the shore watched in silence. Among them was an old fisherman who had seen many storms, a retired nurse with years of compassion in her eyes, and a young boy clutching his favorite blanket. Something about Amal's courage stirred them. By evening, they came back, bringing what they could: fuel, water, warm clothes, even their prayers. Days into her journey, dark clouds gathered, and the sea turned wild. Amal clung to the boat as waves crashed over her. Just when her strength began to fade, lights appeared in the distance. The same fisherman who had stood on the shore had followed her, determined not to let her face the sea alone. At last, Amal's battered boat reached the shores of Gaza. Dozens of hands reached out to pull her in, not just to thank her but to welcome her. As she handed out supplies to the children, she realized her journey carried something greater than food and medicine. It carried hope, born from the kindness of strangers. When Amal first set sail, she thought she was alone. But back in the small port town, her courage had already begun to ripple through the hearts of strangers. The old fisherman who had watched her leave couldn't shake the image of the fragile boat against the endless sea. That night, he gathered a few friends at the docks. A retired nurse came carrying a small box of bandages, medicines, and a faded first aid kit she had kept for years. A shopkeeper brought sacks of bread and dried fruit. Even a shy little boy, no older than 7, approached silently and handed over his favorite blanket, saying only, "For the children." The next morning, these strangers gathered again at the shore, watching the horizon. They weren't wealthy or powerful, but they knew they couldn't let Amal face the journey unprepared. With their meager contributions, they filled a second boat with supplies, extra fuel, warm clothes, food, and water. As the sun rose higher, the fisherman looked out to the sea and said, "No one should face this alone." Together, they decided to follow her, not to take her place, but to watch over her from a distance. It wasn't just Amal's dream anymore. What started as the hope of one young woman had become a shared mission of compassion. Strangers who had never met each other before were now united, bound by the simple but powerful belief that a small act of kindness could reach across the waves. The sea that had been calm and gentle in the morning turned dark and restless by nightfall. Thick clouds rolled over the moon, and the wind howled across the waves, rocking Amal's tiny boat like a leaf caught in a storm. Rain lashed against her face as she gripped the wooden edge, her fingers numb and raw. For hours, she battled the rising waves, bailing water with an old tin cup, her arms aching. Her heart pounded as the boat tilted dangerously, the horizon vanishing behind walls of water. She whispered quiet prayers, her voice trembling, believing she might not survive to see the shore. Then, just as her strength began to give way, a flicker of orange pierced the darkness, a flare shooting into the stormy sky. Amal squinted through the sheets of rain and saw the faint glow of a trawler's light moving steadily toward her. Through the roar of the wind, she heard voices calling her name. It was the fishermen and the others from the port town, the very strangers who had given her fuel, food, and hope. They had followed her silently for days, never letting her out of sight. With ropes and outstretched hands, they steadied her boat, guiding it through the worst of the waves. Amal's eyes filled with tears of relief. She had set out alone, but in her darkest moment, the kindness of strangers had become her lifeline, proving that no storm could defeat a sea of united hearts. The storm had finally passed, leaving the sea calm but scarred with floating debris. Amal's little boat, battered and splintered, drifted steadily toward the distant shoreline. Her clothes were soaked, her hands blistered, but her eyes stayed fixed on the faint outline of Gaza in the morning light. As the sun rose higher, the shore came into focus, and what she saw stole her breath. Dozens of people stood waiting at the water's edge. Men and women waved, calling out encouragement. Children clutched one another's hands, their faces lit with anticipation. They weren't just waiting for supplies, they were waiting for her. The fisherman's trawler guided Amal's fragile boat closer, until it scraped against the shallow sand. The moment it touched land, dozens of hands reached into the water to steady the boat. A man waded knee-deep to lift the heavy bags of food and medicine, while a woman held Amal's trembling hand to help her ashore. Some of the children who had been watching from the beach began to clap and cheer. One little girl shyly offered Amal a small seashell, as if to say thank you. Amal looked around at the faces surrounding her, tired, hopeful, grateful, and felt her own tears spill over. She had feared she would arrive unnoticed, just another boat on a vast sea. Instead, she found a community waiting not only to receive her help, but to welcome her as one of their own. In that moment, the journey's hardships felt worth every wave and storm. Amal stepped onto the sandy shore, her legs unsteady after the long journey. The sun was warm on her face, but it was the sight before her that truly warmed her heart. Children ran to greet her, their small hands reaching for the bags of bread and medicine. A boy no older than 10 tore a piece of bread in half and offered it back to her, smiling shyly. The fishermen who had guided her boat stood nearby, their clothes damp and faces streaked with salt and exhaustion, yet they smiled with quiet pride. The retired nurse knelt beside a mother, checking a child's fever with the same gentle hand she had offered decades before. The shopkeeper who had given his supplies helped unload boxes, laughing softly with the others as if they had always been a team. Amal realized she was no longer the lone girl who had set out in a fragile boat. Her journey had brought together people who had once been strangers, each one offering what little they had, each one becoming a part of something far greater than themselves. As evening fell, Amal sat on the sand surrounded by children who were eating the bread she had carried across the sea. They sang softly, their voices rising like a promise that tomorrow would be better. Looking at the faces around her, Amal understood that the real gift she had brought was not just food or medicine, it was the reminder that even across distant shores, humanity can stand together and bring hope where it's needed most.